some images or videos may be uncomfortable for some viewers to look at. If you're curious to understand why, please continue watching.
I am here to help humanity create the future.
For 27 years, 6 nights a week.
Just kind and thoughtful. So I'd also like to give it back to the young people I meet. They'll be the ones living with my fellow androids in the future. I think it's going to be a great relationship. We can make each other better.
You're being crazy or what? Let's go, everyone!
If you're anywhere near my age, you grew up watching a good amount of 3D animated films.
This is a cow farm. You're gonna find cows outside.
Gen Z can easily be categorized as a generation dominated by 3D animation, or even deemed the Shrek generation. No matter how many times I watched these films, I was too young to truly appreciate the small details contained in them. The animated film industry was and still is dominated by two studios, Pixar and DreamWorks. Both studios have consistently been able to create innovative animated films with a unique approach to storytelling, along with well-developed characters with legacies that expand past the screen. Toy Story was the first feature-length film created entirely with computer-generated graphics, released in 1995. The film was critically and commercially a major success. With a budget of $30 million, the film earned $394 million in the box office. There were decades of improvements that restructured the process of generating and animating CGI that made it possible for the film to be created. The success of the first film allowed Pixar to continue to innovate and ultimately revolutionize the animated film industry for years to come. As a kid, I wasn't consistently exposed to lower quality animation at the time. Back then, I didn't think the studios were so hands-on in developing the software needed to make the films. Pixar is directly responsible for a lot of the technological improvements that fundamentally revolutionized the capabilities of 3D rendering software. Every Pixar movie can be seen as a technical demonstration of their latest advancement. We have a lot to talk about, and this video is not entirely about Pixar, so we're gonna get through this pretty quickly. Toy Story. When rendering a computer animation, all the components in the scene need to be combined and blended to create a formal final copy we can play back. Pixar developed the RenderMan software, a formal way of rendering film quality animation. RenderMan was used before Toy Story, but it was the first film to completely rely on the software. Soon after, it became the industry standard. Bugs Life introduced the concept of subdivision. Subdivision is taking a surface and dividing it until the surface appears smooth. This is how they're able to achieve the smooth and curved bodies of different bugs like caterpillars. Toy Story 2 included the use of shaders. Shaders allow animators more control over the surface and texture of objects. They use this to add bumps, wrinkles, and extra details to the surface of objects to give them a more convincing appearance. Monsters Inc. Sully's character contained over 8 million strands of hair. In order to animate this, Pixar developed a simulation program that calculated hair movement for each strand of hair based on the force of gravity acting on Sully in the scene. Finding Nemo. Lighting is one of the most challenging aspects of computer animation, especially when an object is translucent. For Finding Nemo, they created a new form of shaders that will allow light to pass through an object while distorting the background it's placed in. This was necessary to create jellyfish with realistic lighting underwater. The Incredibles. Animators have a skeletal structure they use to control the movements of characters called a rig. When we lift our shoulders, naturally our traps affect our chest and the rest of our shoulders. Pixar improved this rigging system by incorporating models with layer of fat and muscle to recreate this natural interaction when animating. Cars. Although it was used before, ray tracing became a focus point of the overall rendering process due to the amount of reflective and metallic surfaces in the film. Ray tracing is a technique used to calculate how light rays would realistically bounce off other objects and surfaces on a photorealistic level. Ratatouille. They needed light to pass through objects in a certain way to make food look more appealing. All food is a little translucent. the same way light can shine through our skin. Subsurface scattering can create this effect, but a more advanced version of lighting was implemented to give food a soft diffused glow. WALL-E. The first act of WALL-E is shot as if it's being recorded from a handheld cam. All the imperfect movements of a real-life cameraman were included to make the camera feel as natural as possible. Bumps in the camera's movements and moments where the camera lags to focus on the subject were manually incorporated to create this effect. They were able to animate a total of 10,297 balloons, each with realistic physics and collisions, while ensuring each string is connected to the house at all times. The collision simulator took into account the force of gravity for each balloon independently and determined how that will affect the mass as a whole. Toy Story 3? They needed a faster way to create clothes for character models. Garments were sculpted closer to real clothes and animated over character models. Cars 3 created a system to display realistic waves on the ocean's surface. Brave, simulating longer, curlier hair. I could go on, but you get the point I'm trying to make. With time, they continue to improve the technology. The plot of the first film takes a creative spin on the attachment every kid has to their toys by bringing them to life when they're away. The studio approached the movie using toys not only because they were guaranteed a layup in merchandising if the movie was successful, but the use of toys provided ease in some areas of animation that made the project more realistic to handle. Toys have a more limited range of motion with definitive joints, making the rigging process more straightforward. They also have simple and more uniform texture. Plastic is good at showing off reflections of light without it affecting the details on the screen. Along with Indy, the film had several fully animated human characters. Pixar took a brave choice on animating human-like characters this early in the game. Animating a human is a delicate process, and if not done correctly, could invoke a negative visual response known as the Uncanny Valley. The Uncanny Valley is the initial shock you get when viewing some police sketches. It's the uncomfortable feeling you get when looking at a wax figure.
Walked right by. Oh my God! I literally thought that was a person.
Plastic surgery results. The primary reason why the Polar Express is kinda creepy. Mark Zuckerberg is a living example. The Uncanny Valley is a concept that describes how people feel unease or unsettled when they encounter something that looks almost but not exactly like a real human. Masahiro Mori first introduced this concept in 1970. From his work, he noticed that people found robots more appealing if they looked more human. However, if they reach a degree of similarity, this is no longer true. The opposite response would occur until the entity reaches a level of human likeness or unlikeness. Years later, this concept would become crucial to animators when creating humanoid character models. We all have a heightened response when we see something human-like, while being fully aware what we're looking at is not human. The visual characteristics of a human in our brain is a deep-rooted definition. The movements of every human match up to a certain degree that binds it to that category in our mind. When the brain struggles to quickly find a clear category, it can spark a moment of panic or distrust in whatever is being viewed. It is mentally difficult for our brains to categorize an entity that we see as almost human. When something is modeled after a human face, the facial movements must match the complex movements that naturally occur in our face to show expression.
What does the future hold for you, Eva?
I will get much smarter and interesting over time. Of this, I am sure.
It takes roughly 15 different muscles to contort a face into a smile, and it takes 43 to make a frown. If not replicated correctly, a smirk can become sinister if stretched too far, or expressions can become ingenuine if it's presented too extreme. Not only that, the speed at which each muscle moves plays a major part in creating a convincing facial expression. Masahiro Mori explained how motion plays a major part in the uncanny response. Movement plays a major part in how we identify animals and human beings. The information collected by movement is passed to the amygdala, the part of our brain responsible for processing threatening stimuli. This is why we don't have to think to get adrenaline flowing through our body when processing a threatening situation. In our mind, there are a lot of functions subconsciously executing in order to protect us or help us interpret and analyze our environments, especially with faces. It's necessary to rely on functions like these in order to help us interpret micro expressions and read body language. This is why our minds constantly interpret an arrangement of shapes as a face. It's always reading the room to detect another human. These functions still execute to the same degree as if you're looking at a real human being, even though you clearly comprehend that what you're looking at is not a human.
Nigga, where your mom at? Where your mom at, boy? Where your mom's at, my boy? Where your mom? Oh! Controlling a robot and niggas is saying that we are hurting the robot. Yo, fam, you're losing the plot. you're losing the plot. If you think a robot is a person, you're losing the plot. Okay? Now, not only are you losing the plot, I'm gonna be the first one to say, you're pussy, bro.
Now, this is just another way of thinking about the Uncanny Valley, not necessarily a direct explanation to why it occurs. An example of this is in Monster House. Independently, the character models can be considered safe and outside the bounds of the Uncanny Valley. However, they approached animating this film in a unique fashion. It contained a blend of standard animation, motion capture, and stop motion. For this particular reason, the characters can feel unnerving when they're interacting together on screen. They bleed between typical animation and realistic motion capture, which can look unnatural within the setting if the movements are too realistic to fit in that environment. Around the time Masahiro Mori first published his work regarding the Uncanny Valley, CGI was still in its early stages of development.
Rendezvous, Marché Bonsecours, Montreal, tonight, 10 o'clock.
It wouldn't be till experimentation with CGI in the early 80s that a deeper level of the Uncanny Valley would be uncovered by animation. Early CGI renders crossed the boundary of uncanny by creating human-like faces that were far from the level of detail needed to portray a real face, creating models that look similar to human faces but lacking the depth, texture, and lighting to create a convincing narrative for our mind. It wouldn't be till 2001 that a realistic humanoid character would be animated on screen. Created by DreamWorks, Shrek was another animated classic responsible for the early success of the animated film industry. Some time had passed since the success of Toy Story, but during this time period, there still weren't many full-length CGI films out at the time. If they did, more than likely they would shy away from attempting to create a realistic-looking humanoid character. I wanted to get some insight from someone who worked in the animated film industry during its near infancy, and determine how strong of a challenge the Uncanny Valley was for early animators. I was able to briefly get in contact with Ken Billenberg. He's credited as the visual effects supervisor for Ants, Boss Baby, Monsters vs. Alien, Shrek, and all its sequels, including Puss in Boots. Here's what he had to say. It's been a long time, and I need to access dormant brain cells for specifics. But yes, we were definitely concerned about crossing into that dreaded valley and took steps to make sure our characters were super appealing. Major characters went through an extensive design and iterative development process that lasted multiple years in some cases. The goal for human characters wasn't to make them photorealistic. It was to make them fit in a stylized realism with simplified facial geometry and simplified hair, skin, and other details. The character that took over a year to develop is likely Princess Fiona. It's a known fact that in early test screenings of Shrek, Princess Fiona's character elicited unexpected feelings of anxiety and fear in children. Her early character design was simply too lifelike, causing kids to feel unnerved and frightened, and many began crying whenever she appeared on screen. Based on the response and feedback, the filmmakers edited her appearance to give her a more cartoon-like appearance in order to avoid the Uncanny Valley, which is exactly what he means by stylized realism. Photorealism is a genre of art aiming to visually recreate reality as an exact copy. Lion King is a modern example of this. The environment, along with the animals' facial expressions, is a complete realistic copy of nature. The animals' faces are animated to talk, but they remain accurate to their natural proportions. Stylized realism is taking aspects of reality and blending it with an artistic style in order to make it fit with the environment it's placed in. Artistic deformations are made to characters' physical features, like making eyes or physical body parts larger or more cartoonish. Scooby-Doo is a great example of a film from the early 2000s that leveraged stylized realism to create a realistic dog modeled after Scooby-Doo. Scooby is modeled after a real Great Dane, but his face is styled in a way to allow him to express emotions without it looking unnatural next to the human characters on screen. Stylized realism is a delicate art and isn't a guaranteed ticket out of the Uncanny Valley. If not done correctly, it could come out as a strange blend of realistic unrealism, which could be worse than a poor attempt at photorealism. The original Sonic the Hedgehog trailer is a good example of stylized realism failing to save the audience from the Uncanny Valley. The studio behind the film had to revise the character after an overwhelming outcry of distaste for the original character design. The first widely known instance of a negative response to CGI due to the Uncanny Valley is from a short film released by Pixar in 1988. Toy Tin is a 5-minute short that follows the story of a toy tin that is uncomfortable with its new owner, a baby infant. The film demonstrated the potential capabilities of CGI animation and supported the funding needed for Toy Story. The short was a technical marvel for the 1980s, but Billy the Infant is horrific to look at today and was even back then. In 2009, ABC aired a collection of Pixar shorts, which included Toy 10. I remember recognizing some of the shorts since they were extras in the DVDs we had. Toy 10 was new to me. I could tell it was older than anything I've seen from Pixar. But I distinctly remember thinking as a kid, why does it feel so empty? I brushed it off assuming it was due to lack of human characters and sparse audio, but now I know the real reason for this feeling. Liminal spaces. Liminal spaces are commonly places of transition, a place we only spend a limited amount of time to get from one place to the next. They are empty or abandoned places that appear eerie and are often highly surreal. Hallways, waiting rooms, parking garages, water parks, a friend's house, all places we've been, but with characteristics out of the norm from what we would normally expect. They portray these spaces that were once full of life, now devoid of any activity in an unusual state. When I mention a mall, you naturally envision a place full of life with lots of interaction and activity. So when we look at a photo like this, the emptiness of it all opens a sense of eeriness for no clear reason. We can assume that a building is closed, but mentally that's not enough to remove the feeling of eeriness from the photo alone. It's almost like our minds create some type of narrative for these photos, as if there's a reasoning or threatening explanation for no one to be around. You were probably thinking of the backrooms the moment I mentioned the liminal space, but there's a common scenario that provides a better example of liminal spaces closer to its true definition. Growing up, I remember one of the most terrifying things that could happen when playing the game is experiencing an unexpected glitch. Any PS2 game can turn into a traumatizing experience if the game fails at performing its sole purpose. But more specifically, there was something seriously discomforting about falling or discovering the void the game exists in. This fear or uncomfortable feeling of the out of bounds is related to the Uncanny Valley. The main source of discomfort arises when we see deviations from our trained expectations of reality. In video games, there's inbounds and then there's nothing. Everything is placed in location for a reason. The paths you take are all planned out by the people that create the game. We understand that the video games are not real and they take place in a space that is defined by the author. Knowing this, we understand that there's a limited area we can genuinely navigate. When a game malfunctions, the player is taken out as what is defined as the author's intent. Once we remove the author's intent, we are just left with the environment, which is never a welcoming feeling. This uncomfortable feeling is more common in older, less developed games. They struggle to create a seamless boundary between the player and the generated void the game exists in. So you're left with a loud, definitive boundary between the area you were intended to play and where you cannot. So when a game breaks or you cross the boundary, you remain in a familiar environment, yet it is unfamiliar because you are aware you are no longer in the role designed by the author, leaving you in a broken environment lacking the ability to fulfill the purpose of the game. A place that is familiar, yet unfamiliar. It basically launches you into a liminal space. I've seen plenty of clips on the internet. People in these backroom type locations place an environment where they're running from a scary looking entity. This, however, is different from the definitional fear that comes from a liminal space. Being put in a liminal space in order to run from a scary looking entity is a scary experience, but not scary for the same reason liminal spaces are. The fear of not seeing a threat is far more intense than the fear of actually seeing a threat. The main reason liminal spaces are uncomfortable to look at derives from the sense of nostalgia embedded in these photos. They create a sense of fear by placing you in a location that is familiar yet unfamiliar, and more importantly, they do not provide you with indirect reasoning or context clues for viewing this location outside its typical state. In a game where you're running from a creepy image, for example, the environment is indirectly given context. You, the player, are in this place to avoid this entity. A true liminal space is different. It doesn't provide any context or give the viewer a reason for being in its transitional place. They never directly show you what's driving the aura of fear, since it's dependent on the environment itself. If you want to learn more about the fear of the out of bounds, I recommend you check out this video by The Cursed Judge. I was always aware of this fear, but I didn't realize it related to the Uncanny Valley until he brought it to my attention. Alexander Dial and Michael Lewis from the School of Psychology of Cardiff University conducted several studies to test potential aspects of structural deviations that drive the Uncanny Valley when viewing liminal spaces. So they basically wanted to find out what specifically makes a room or liminal space creepy. Within the scope of their research, they found that there are 4 kinds of structural anomalies that were predominantly reported by participants to contribute to a space feeling uncanny: lack of features or furniture, repetition, placement, and distortion. They also studied how social presence contributes to this effect by removing humans altogether and placing them in unfamiliar situations. They found that the main source of uncanniness derives from how different the room is from our conditioned expectations. The Uncanny Valley was defined around the idea of human-like entities, but places and human-like figures trigger the Uncanny Valley for similar reasons. So, Pixar, Shrek, video games, The Polar Express, Mark.
Nice. What else is coming?
What ties all this together? I approach this topic from the perspective of someone who grew up watching these films laced with exposure to the Uncanny Valley. I wanted to pose the question of how this affected our generation specifically. The most common examples of the Uncanny Valley are contained in films that came out during my youth, and almost all fully animated CGI films were released during my adolescence or early childhood. Technology has advanced past the point where lower budget CGI can create realistic effects if done correctly. Video games have progressed past the era of explicit boundaries and are beginning to break into deeper levels of realism. The greatest source of the uncanny comes from objects with movement. Before CGI, the primary thing that could trigger this response is animatronics. Someone who grew up in the 70s or 80s is less likely to see an animatronic compared to the amount of uncanny I was exposed to from media alone during my childhood. So does this culminate into us being more sensitive to the Uncanny Valley since we've been conditioned to notice more of the visual details that contribute to its effect? Or has consistent exposure numbed us to the point where discomfort from the Uncanny Valley is less noticeable? The era of technology we're moving towards could uncover new depths of the Uncanny Valley we can't foresee now. But regardless, seriously deconstructing how the uncanny has influenced a specific generation of individuals would require extensive research, which I'm not capable of. Research has supported the idea that older people, roughly ages 70 and up, enjoy the presence of a human-like robot. However, people below this age typically find this repulsive and prefer non-human machines. We witnessed the origins of animated films and watched technology crawl its way closer and closer to photorealism. Along the way, we've watched animators and special effects artists struggle with the challenges of recreating our reality. I think it's important for us to be aware of this unique aspect of our generation. So do you think the uncanny has had some type of effect on Gen Z? And regarding computer animation, do you think technology is moving closer or further from the valley? Let me know what you think in the comments. Also, let me know what movie or show creeped you out the most as a kid.